Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We are here to talk about if anyone's seen Zoolander data privacy, which is so hot right now. But in reality, we hear about it every day. People need more and better data privacy, especially when it comes to consent. So I'm so happy to have Alex Cash here today from OneTrust to talk with me about what consent means, why it's important, and really how to do it well when cookies go away. So Alex, so excited to have you here and to talk through this.
Thanks for having me.
I love it. All right, so real quick, what we're going to talk through today, we're going to have a quick overview of who we are, why you need to care about consent, which I don't think is a surprise to anyone, but some of those little nuances may be surprising to us, things that we need to consider when things like regulations and browser restrictions, things like that are changing every single day. What this partnership means to really be informed and proactive in doing compliance and consent when it comes to your customer data, and probably most importantly, how to get started. For those of you joining live, we will have time for a live Q&A with us as well, so make sure to stay tuned for that. And any questions you have throughout, please feel free to put them in the chat and we will get to them. So let's get started. A little bit about us here at MetaRouter. So we, at our core, are a server-side tag management system, but we like to say we're not your typical tag manager, right? So what we do is, yes, we do remove third-party tags from your website so that you can still maintain parity with everything you're doing. But not only that, we help you centralize everything else when it comes to things like compliance, like consent. So you have a centralized location to do all of that. So we like to talk about it, and you'll hear more from Alex on what data trust means and why that's important. And in MetaRouter, we see that as control, quality, and compliance as the core of building data trust and having MetaRouter as a central layer or lever, if you will, to control those things. So all of that customer data that you have come flowing in real time is controlled by you, is fully compliant, is high quality. So anywhere that data goes, any CDP or analytics tools, whatever it might be, is powered with really good and compliant customer data. So now let's talk a little bit about OneTrust and what they do.
Thanks, Michelle. So hi, everyone. My name is Alex Cash. I work at OneTrust specifically on our consent products, but OneTrust as a business serves a much broader perspective of solutions. The idea is that the company represents and we build what we call the trust intelligence platform, and we make it easier to build and demonstrate trust, measure and manage risk, and go beyond compliance. I've been at the company since the really early days, and things have grown and changed a lot. And today we have about 2,500 employees, a little north of 14,000 customers. And we're serving a number of what we call trust domains, like different product disciplines. One of those, and our bread and butter really in terms of our brand, is heavily focused on privacy management, data governance, and consent. But we also serve GRC, ESG, and ethics use cases as well. If you could go to the next slide. Now, in terms of a kind of company mission, we're all focused on building trust, and that relates to trust with employees, customers, partners, investors, the broader markets, etc. And really kind of framing that up is what we call the trust gap. So 91% of executives say that trust impacts revenue, both top line and bottom line. And additionally, 82% say that high levels of customer trust make it easier to innovate. Now, the kind of irony here is on the next slide, if we see that 84% of executives believe that consumers trust them, but in reality, that number is only 27%. So there's a differential here between intentions, beliefs, and reality. And really what we're focused on here is helping those business leaders to bridge that trust gap and bring everyone along on that journey, both consumers, employees, investors, and so on.
So that's exactly what brought us here today. So when you think about user consent, of course, you also have to think about what you're collecting with that, right? The information that you're collecting, what you're doing with that data, where it goes. And so the reason that we are joining forces to talk about this today is we want to help you collect that customer data in regards to consent. So like Alex mentioned, I want you all to think about what that trust gap, the expectations versus reality might look like in your organization, because when you think about data collection with a true privacy and consent focused lens, that's when you'll have success again with everything you do with that customer data. So I want you all to think about that as we talk through what this really means for your organization. So we like to talk about proactive consent, right? Ensuring that compliance and consent is enforced at the moment of collection and managed just as easily as that is enforced. So as things change, it can be easy to update your cookie preferences, but how do you still make sure that those user preferences are really enforced as you're collecting data in real time as it's being streaming to all these downstream systems? Alex, I don't know if you have some thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, I think so. There's a phrase that we like to use internally, which is that your website is the front yard of your privacy program. Like, it's the one place that pretty much anyone can interact with your brand. It's also one of the places that it's easiest to capture data from individuals directly and to share it with third parties. Therefore, it's just like inherently risky. When we talk about consent management, there's loads of different shapes and sizes of it, but websites is the most frequently used product that we offer in that space. And we ran some metrics a couple of weeks ago, and we're serving quite literally billions of consent events every day. Meaning that there are, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people every single day whose choices need to be respected. Now, what we're very good at is providing the interfaces to make sure that a customer can collect valid consent. But the way that you build your websites and your apps and so on, you need to then enforce that consent. You need to actually respect the decision of the user. That's why we're working together, because between OneTrust and MetaRouter, we're able to not only just collect, but then respect and enforce those decisions as it relates to data sharing with third parties. In fact, I was working with Michele's colleague last week via email, and we managed to set up an implementation of this partnership on a real website. I think it was in about half an hour via about 3 or 4 emails. And that's the idea here, is that capture the choice, but then obviously respect it as well.
Yeah. Oh, it was really fun to watch. And we'll actually see the output of that in real time on today's conversation as well, which was really, really cool to see. So let's talk about why you all need to care. Again, not because you don't know this, but to think about it within this lens, because it is important to consider all the things that are happening. Of course, the cookie deprecation, but also what does that mean as you're thinking about how you're managing and enforcing consent. Right. So let's level set a little bit. So yes, we all know about cookie deprecation, cookieless future, the cookie apocalypse, whatever you might want to call it. And this is just the beginning, right? So while I do feel like the market is hyper focused on cookies right now, and we should be, right? We need to prepare for this, not just for marketing and attribution and tracking, of course, compliance and consent as well. But I also want to think about that this isn't the first time something big has happened in our space that we're constantly having to react to, having to change our systems, having to update things and so on. So you've got things like GDPR, you've got Cambridge Analytics, ITP for privacy, the death of cookies, and now Google is talking about potentially their privacy sandbox, right? So there's one thing after another. And what we see all the time at MetaRouter is people having to retroactively do things to respond to these, right? There's nothing in place that proactively kind of readies you for all of these changes, which makes it a really, really stressful time. For everyone that we help with kind of this cookie deprecation situation when it comes to customer data collection and tracking, they're like, oh my gosh, I wish I had something not just to prepare for a cookieless future, but all of these other things that are happening, the browser changes, the regulations, which Alex will talk about in a minute. But if you have a centralized control plane to make sure that you are ready for all these changes and whatever might come in the future, is really the best way to do proactive compliance, right? So that's kind of, the browser world, the cookie world, the Google world that we're talking about and living in, which is crazy, but it doesn't have to be. So I want to separate the nuance here of that with what we see with regulations. So I'm going to have Alex talk through the regulation overview and some of the nuances that you really need to think about within this space.
Thank you. I think it's worth mentioning, so third-party cookies are being deprecated in Chrome supposedly this year, but we've already lost, or I say we, the market has already lost access to the majority of third-party signal identifiers. We saw those changes on iOS were very significant. We've seen cookie deprecation in browsers like Firefox and Safari. We've also seen some changes proposed from the team at Microsoft as it relates to Edge in the near future as well. So yeah, to your point, Michele, none of this is new.
Yeah.
What I wanted to also give a bit of historical context on is some of the privacy regulations and the requirements, because what we're seeing in the US, typically, I think it's fair to say that is partly kind of inspired by some of the changes in Europe. Europe is a continually developing market. We saw GDPR in 2018. Way before that, we had e-privacy. We're expecting updates to e-privacy in the European Union. We've also seen the Digital Markets Act, which has had a significant impact on some of the largest vendors in the space, including Google. So yeah, let me take you back to 2018 and sort of explain where a lot of this comes from and why a lot of our customers are using our products for consent management, and then how that relates to the US as well. So in Europe, you have two laws that are really important to understand when you're thinking about consent management on a website. GDPR itself as a regulation governs a really broad range of applications and usages of customer or consumer data. And GDPR gives you a few particular reasons, what are called legal bases for processing personal data in certain situations. One of those legal bases is consent. Now, you'll see some people say you always need consent to process personal data. That is not true. But it is true in certain applications, and that's kind of where we are now in terms of looking at websites. So I've lost the slide. Okay, there we go. So there are two articles in GDPR that are kind of defining how we think about consent. And the first is Article 4, the second is Article 7. Article 4 is basically talking about the definitions of consent, meaning consent in Europe needs to be freely given, specific, informed, unambiguous, and given through a clear affirmative action. What that basically means in practice is that you've got to break down what are the different usages of the customer data that you're asking for consent for. Like, what are the actual business activities that I'm doing? And so we can think about, in a website context, the difference between analytics and advertising. Those are two different purposes. And when we ask for consent, you've got to ask somebody or give them the opportunity to say yes to one, but not the other, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's also got to be informed. So we've got to tell people what is it that we're doing. Now, Article 7 also gives us the conditions, meaning like, how do I build an experience that is compliant, and meaning that I can rely on the consent that I've captured up front. So here we see things like it's clearly distinguishable from other matters, meaning it's not like buried in a terms and conditions agreement, that kind of thing. We've seen some regulatory action around that. Clear and plain language. The right to withdraw consent is very important as well. So all of these things very much clearly define what a consent user experience needs to look like. But the reason why we see cookie banners themselves is actually related to a different bit of legislation called the e-privacy directive. The e-privacy directive predates GDPR. And a directive means it can be implemented slightly differently in each of the European Union member states. However, we're expecting this to be replaced by the e-privacy regulation in the near future, but that's been a long time coming, so unclear exactly when that will go into effect. But if we go back one slide, I just want to very quickly pick on something specific here. The e-privacy directive, Article 5, I'm going to just read this out. It says, prohibit listening, tapping, storage, or other kinds of interception without the consent of the users concerned. This paragraph shall not prevent technical storage which is necessary for the conveyance of a communication. If I translate that into simpler English, what this is saying is that you cannot read and write data to a user's device without their consent, unless it is strictly necessary for the service to work. So this is where we get the cookie law from, right? It doesn't say anything about cookies, it just says storage. But we're talking here about technologies that are not necessarily strictly required for the website to work, but could be used for other applications like advertising, analytics, and so on. And this is where we have the requirement for consent. And this predates GDPR. And then GDPR brought us a new definition of consent in terms of the requirements and the provisions and the user experience. So what we see in Europe is that when someone hits a website, these optional or unnecessary technologies are off by default. However, in the US, the law has been written differently. And what we predominantly see in the majority of situations is that these technologies are enabled until the user withdraws that consent. Now, on the next slide, what you're going to see here is what has been generously deemed the patchwork of US privacy regulation. Each of these items is a different date on which you're going to see one or more states go live with a new privacy regulation. This number keeps growing. This slide we keep having to update. All of these have a lot of common threads, and many of them have the ability for consumers to opt out of certain types of data processing. The CCPA in California came into effect first and really set the kind of the trend, really. And they have a definition which is allowing users to opt out of the sale or share of their personal information. Again, to translate here, what we're specifically talking about in most cases is the ability for a website to use your data to share it to third parties for the purposes of showing ads, building ads profiles, and measuring ad viewership, that kind of thing. Not every state is the same, but there's a lot of common language between these. And the way that I generally think about it is that in Europe, it's off until the user says yes and they opt in. However, in the US, in most places, in most cases, these technologies are enabled, these tags, I should say, are enabled until the user opts out.
So yeah, I feel like every day I hear a new state with a new regulation and something, something we all have to be considering and thinking about. So I don't know about you all. This is how I feel when I hear about the changes every day, again, between, all the regulations, the state specific, US versus the UK. I mean, it is really, really hard to keep up and to keep reacting to what is going on in the market. So what we're seeing, I think we are pretty similar on this, is that taking back control and making sure you have control of that data and really eliminating as much reliance as you can on like third parties is really the future and what we have to think about so that you don't fall into some of those risky compliance issues that we are seeing, half of them being caused by third-party data breaches. And, our goal is to really minimize that, but also put control and consent back in companies' hands. So again, what we say here is really that comes down to being proactive, to having the tools in place so that you can flag these risks up front. Because what we hear right now is that by the time you identify a risk downstream, like there's already issue. If there is a risk being identified in Facebook, some other system, there's already a problem and you're going into triage and it's not fun and it's often really, really pricey, right? And you lose that trust that we talked about earlier with consumers, with internal teams that are using that data, and it's not good for anybody. So what does a centralized control hub for proactive compliance and consent really look like? So Alex, I'll let you kind of dig into what that looks like on the OneTrust end.
Alrighty, so I'm just going to go through a brief demonstration of how we set up one of our consent products looking at a website, bearing in mind, of course, that we also think about other sort of digital experiences like mobile apps and connected TV apps. And also you've got to think about consent coming from other places like in-person experiences and so on. I'm sharing my screen. Michelle, can you just confirm you can see my architecture slide?
You're good.
Okay. So we're talking about what we call a CMP, which is an industry term for consent management platform. And I'm going to take you through the 4 steps that our customers will pursue in setting up one of these products. We'll start with the audit of your websites. And again, bear in mind, we're going to be thinking here about lots of different types of websites and digital experiences and apps and so on. But the way that our customers support this is within the product, we maintain a list of websites. And you can just come in and load these in. You can do it in bulk as you wish. And when you set that up, you just basically type in or copy paste your URLs and then set some of these scanning parameters. Like, do I want to scan from Europe or the US? How many pages do I want to scan? Are there any kind of specific pages I want to start with, and site maps, etc.? The product will go away and audit the site. And what it will do is then categorize the results based on purpose. I was talking earlier about some of those different use cases, right? We have some predefined categories that we use to look at the results that we get back from the scan. So are these cookies used for performance purposes? That's like analytics. Is it advertising, targeting, marketing, that kind of thing? And we'll give you some descriptions alongside those groupings. Now, the scan doesn't just look at cookies, though. Obviously, it looks at tags as well. And so where we think here about this partnership is these tags that are loading through MetaRouter, we are going to be seeing them loading on the website. We're going to be looking at them in terms of scan results and categorizing them accordingly. Now, once you've done the scan, you can repeat the scan, let it run in the background every few weeks or as frequently as you need. And then we're going to start looking at the user experience. So I think what I kind of tried to highlight earlier was that the user experience is really what you need to focus on in terms of making sure that your consent is valid. And there's a lot of complexity that we're trying to distill down into a single kind of user interface. So the first thing you want to think about is what we call the template, which is like, what does the user see when they hit your site? I'll show you an example later, but you can see that we've got a number of these pre-built out of the platform for you to make use of. This list is just going to get longer, but you can take these, customize, or you can start with your own instead and build out the look and feel, the layout, the styling, the branding, the color schemes, the buttons, the options, everything like that is in the product. So it's like very much a like click and edit kind of builder where you can put in colors and all those things I just touched on. Typically, we see kind of like 3 layers. You have this initial modal, then you have what we call a preference center, and then you can have like a privacy notice, a cookie notice with the results of your scans displayed to the user and further descriptions. Once you've built out the template, and that could just be one or it could be many, you then want to be thinking about what we call the geolocation rules. This is how do I configure the product based on where someone's coming from? And I mentioned a moment ago that we typically think about like Europe as opt-in and the US as opt-out. And so what we do on the left-hand side here is you create these rules and you say, hey, for the region that is the EU, I am going to use a particular template that I've configured. In this case, it's using my GDPR language. And then I'm going to set my consent to be opt-in. It means it's off by default. I can customize that. I can tailor it and I can change the model. But once I build out all these rules, I can then, combine them into a policy. So here, my US policy, I have an opt-out model instead, meaning these cookies and technologies are turned on. Once I've built this out, I want to be deploying this. So this is where we come to the deployment and integration. And this is where the partnership really starts to be worked on between us and MetaRouter, because we are going to create a script and we're going to publish changes to that script. That script is also known as a tag, and you're going to deploy that through MetaRouter to your websites in order to start displaying, capturing consent. Here's an example of what that looks like on the OneTrust website. You see we have this banner across the bottom of the screen. I can accept, reject, or customize, and I can come in and turn on and off each of these different categories of cookies. Now, we'll see this in the demo, but MetaRouter is listening for those signals that are set in the CMP provided by OneTrust. The last thing is in terms of that monitoring and optimization. So I talked already about the rescanning. That's automated. You can rescan every few weeks. But there's also the monitoring and reporting in terms of the kind of consent behaviors. So we can see these anonymous consent receipts over time. And we're just going to see how many people are opting in, how many people are opting out, what is my overall percentages, and understand the just general health of my deployment, and potentially catch any issues with my config that I may need to update and push out over time. That's me, Michelle. Hand it back to you.
Yeah, perfect. So I will go through our VP of sales in EMEA did, like Alex said, went from like access to demo in 30 minutes. So let's take a look at what that looks like from the MetaRouter perspective. So let's.
Hi everyone, my name is Neil Brookman, and today I'm going to go through a bit of a demo showcasing how OneTrust and MetaRouter can work together, with OneTrust being the consent management tool, collecting and managing consents, and MetaRouter is used as a consent enforcement tool. So the first thing I'm going to do is go over to just a demo website, and I'm going to look at the cookie consents and allow all. By allowing all of the consents, that's allowing MetaRouter to do a call out to each of the third-party vendors to get the identifiers back and store them in a first-party cookie. The demo site is using implicit consent. If we had explicit consent, then we'd have to have consent before we do the call out. But what that means is, as I'm now clicking through the website and starting to browse, we have events being sent through to MetaRouter with all of the various consent parameters activated. What I can do is remove consent for targeting cookies. And if I refresh the page, MetaRouter is restricting the first-party cookies that are allowed to be stored. So we're removing all of those cookies, and we're no longer doing that call out to any of the advertising platforms itself. I can also remove performance cookies, and the movable ink cookie has gone away as well. So as I'm clicking through, and if I just very quickly go into the console here and refresh the page, MetaRouter is getting all of the consent objects, and we can see consent C0004 is set to true for opt-out, and C004 is targeting cookies. So every object that's going through MetaRouter now has that consent flag. If I go into MetaRouter and just do a refresh on our dashboard here, what you will see is all of the events that have been sent through MetaRouter, with a number of them having restrictions for the compliance filter. So Pinterest and Facebook Pixel, we're restricting the events going downstream. And where I had put in a restriction for performance cookies, that's stopping data going down to Google BigQuery as well. What I can do is very easily just take this anonymous ID, and if I go across to Google BigQuery, and in here, I'm going to just run a query. And what you will see when this is loaded is a list of all of the events that have come through MetaRouter in real time, and all of those various opt-out states. So we've got opt-out for targeting cookies for some events, but the original events I did without having consent are still set to false. So data can flow through downstream to the relevant tools with the consent, and then MetaRouter is blocking data going downstream to enforce consent for various platforms, depending on how it's configured. And all of this is configured with OneTrust out of the box. So all of the mappings are there straight away, but you can customize if you want to have additional consent parameters. And just to show, if I give consent back again and refresh, then MetaRouter is able to do those callouts and get the relevant information. And now all of these events that are flowing have false for all of the consent opt-outs. I hope that makes sense, and I hope that's made it clear on how MetaRouter can assist OneTrust with consent. But if you do have any questions, feel free to reach out and we'll be happy to help.
There you go. Oh. So let's talk through really quickly a couple examples or scenarios that we've heard from real customers about how they want to go about using this, right? So scenario one is if a user opts out of the targeting advertising with the OneTrust consent module, and MetaRouter incepts that data flowing into your ad platforms, none of the PII data would be used for targeting ads within that scenario. Another thing that we've heard is if a user consents to website analytics with limited data sharing, that we can then anonymize that data to send to the analytics tools and remove that PII while still giving you the performance analytics on your website that you need, which for that, we've actually really improved the analytics accuracy that are going across platforms for things like this. So some examples of where our customers are talking about this, excited about using it based on what you saw from the setup previously. So really, it all comes back to proactive consent, right? How can we work together between enforcing consent and managing consent, keeping up with everything that's changing, and make sure that you all are protected, you're protecting your users, you're protecting your data, you're protecting your businesses in a really, really strong way. Alex, I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that specifically.
Yeah, I think the idea here is that there's a lot of quite like simple concepts that are actually very technically very difficult to implement. But the way I like to boil it down is to just think about consent is given for a particular kind of activity, like a use case, but you can also combine that with a kind of the relationship or the matrix view of like the use case, but also the vendor or the recipient, right? And so we can think about consent, let's say it's for advertising, and then we could think about, let's say you've got 3 advertising partners. You could allow the user, the consumer, to consent to 1 of 3 or 3 of 3, really. It's up to you. And then the idea here between the partnership is that we're going to take out the complexity of the capture. MetaRouter is going to take out the complexity of the enforcement. The other thing that I think is super important for a lot of our customers, and I'm sure a lot of yours as well, is that it's very, very normal to need to operate in multiple jurisdictions. And those jurisdictions might have different kind of models. And that on-off concept is then just super simple to apply to a European versus US versus different states in the US kind of mindset. And so I just want to make it clear for everyone listening that what OneTrust is doing is working out where someone comes from and what the law is, and whether we should start with a 1 or a 0. What's the language we present to someone? And then MetaRouter is handling all of the kind of like activation of that decision. So really bringing these things together. I didn't exaggerate about the 30-minute implementation window. That really happened. And that's only really possible when you have kind of both sides of the conversation covered.
100%. I love it. And I think with that, we'll jump into any live Q&A. I know, Brittany, you mentioned wanting to chat through Google Consent v2 a little bit. So Alex, I'll let you take that one.
Yeah, okay. So Google obviously is, I think, the largest organization in the world when it comes to digital advertising. And they support pretty much every type of participant in the ecosystem in some way. So that is, when I think about customers that operate websites, customers of ours that operate websites, you can really put them into 2 groups. One is a publisher, meaning they run ads on their website. And one is an advertiser, meaning they buy ads on other websites. Most companies are advertisers, some companies are publishers. Google has different kind of frameworks and technologies and solutions for those different types of company. And Google Consent Mode is primarily aimed at advertisers. There is obviously some blurry lines where publishers need to use it too, but really it's kind of focused primarily on advertisers. And the idea is that it's a framework that allows for a lot of automation around the kind of management and the loading or not loading of tags. Consent Mode v2 is kind of just going into effect right now. There's a deadline. I think it's pretty much now from Google for their customers to adopt it. But from v1 to v2, the kind of the data model that supports the framework has got a little more detailed. There are a couple of new sort of API parameters. And additionally, they've introduced this idea of advanced consent mode and basic consent mode. I won't go into the pros and cons of each of these as well, but safe to say that OneTrust and I'm sure other CMPs support Google Consent Mode. It's a responsibility of the CMP to send the right signals to Google. But of course, that can flow through a server-side tag manager like MetaRouter as well. Google have published and they put up a portal of what they call their CMP partner program, which I'd encourage everyone to look at, to look for providers that offer support to integrate consumer decisions with the Google Consent Mode framework as well.
Always something new, I swear. All right, another question we've got here. So I'm not a legal expert, understood, but I want to maintain strong data privacy practices. What are some straightforward, actionable steps I can take to improve my consent management and enforcement? I've got some thoughts, but I don't know, Alex, if you want to kick it off first. Okay. So kind of, I would say, coming off of what Alex mentioned, like really understanding what you're collecting the consent for, what are your use cases, and where you're sending it. I would say that audit generally is step 1. Like, what information are you collecting? Why are you collecting it? Where is the information going? The reason I say that audit's so important, I would say there's 2 reasons. One, of course, on the tag management side, is that also helps you understand what tags you need. Some are unnecessary, some are duplicative, some you might not even really know about or even on your website. We hear that more often than you would think. So doing that understanding and looking at your tag specifically is a key part of it. What we're actually hearing now is like this tag removal process is really the basis for having better data privacy, because you know what is being tracked, who's tracking it, where's it going. And as part of that too, what we want to do is make sure that the vendors don't see your customer data unless it's in the right form with the right piece parts in place so that your users are protected and their privacy is respected. So I would say kind of back to that, if you think about that 4-step framework that Alex showed, like audit first thing off the bat for sure.
Yeah, certainly audit and automation around audit, super important. There are a number of different ways to go about that. Obviously, we provide a sort of scanning solution. There are other dedicated scanning solutions in the market as well if you're looking for a really, really deep sort of analysis. But that automation is certainly key. The other thing, I know this is probably not what you're expecting me to say, but one of the things that's most difficult for particularly a small team to stay on top of is some of the changes in sort of case law and regulation. So I would highly recommend subscribing to newsletters and publications that cover these topics. Vendors like ourselves have a lot of content that we put out, but there are other sort of industry bodies like the IAPP, which is the largest kind of privacy trade body in the world. And you can subscribe to kind of stay up to date with news as it relates to this. Super important, super valuable, because changes occur based on not just regulation, but findings from regulators and court cases, etc. And that can be challenging. But the other thing I think to really focus in on is a lot of times privacy teams don't really understand what the marketing teams are doing or what the tags the marketing teams are doing. The tags that the marketing team are using are doing. So like a detailed analysis of that, and perhaps even like a data flow diagram, is super valuable for privacy teams to help make the appropriate decisions. And I would always start with that. So scan and represent that data flow to the people that need to make the decisions around risk.
I think that's as being on the marketing side, I think that's a great call. And wanting to put tags anywhere, not knowing, necessarily being that up to date on what those privacy things to think about are, is hugely important. So absolutely agree with that. And documentation is kind of underrated. What we're seeing a lot right now is that marketers have to care more about data privacy, especially like you said on those smaller teams. So keeping that in mind, yeah, I would say is very much key. All right, let's see. One more. My company operates in multiple regions with varying data privacy laws. Yes. Can consent management platforms like OneTrust help me navigate the complexity and ensure global compliance? Alex, I think you touched on this a little bit, but anything to add?
Yeah. So the first thing to think about is like, and this often is a function of how big is your team and what level of investment do you have. But some of our customers deploy a very conservative kind of model across all of their websites, regardless of where someone's coming from. So if they're like a small team and they're based in Europe, have everything be opt-in, so everything's turned off by default. But if a customer is based in the US, they probably go with an opt-out model, right? So the first thing to think about is like, where are you based and what do you care about? Do you need like as many marketing signals as you can get, or do you need to minimize the cost and effort of implementing a solution? So there's always going to be a trade-off. The other thing, of course, is like that kind of geolocation concept, and we talked about that a little bit earlier, but ensure that you're using that if you need it, because then that does allow you to have kind of the automation built in from the get-go. The last thing I think I'll mention here is that you're going to see developing requirements in the US. And so where I showed some of those templates earlier, I would always encourage customers to start there. It's like pre-prepared content and language by state. And as these new state laws go into effect, it looks like we have, almost more than we have states over the next 2 years to start with those. And hopefully that will save a pretty meaningful amount of time in a kind of global deployment.
Yeah, and I would say one other thing to think about on our end with MetaRouter, just because we're talking global here. So we have a lot of big global customers, and we can actually instill dedicated clusters in different regions to make sure that the right, data sovereignty is in place. So I say that because it's just another way to think globally and think in the data privacy perspective. So I think that's really important. So with that, I know we're coming up at time. If anyone has any more questions, we may have time for one more. And if not, I appreciate everyone joining today. I know this is a really hot topic. I feel like Alex and I could probably talk forever about this. But please feel free to reach out. We're always here to help answer questions. Again, if you have anything else, please feel free to let us know. And otherwise, appreciate you joining today.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Michele.
Thanks.